Let's go ahead and get started, and people can join us as they are able. Welcome to the Minnesota Transform Showcase. We're very glad that you're here, and we appreciate your presence, whether it's online or in person. My name is Tracy Deutsch. In terms of a visual description, I'm a short, white woman with dark brown curly hair that I am desperately trying to control with a hair clip today. I'm wearing a black jacket and a dark blue shirt with black pants. For accessibility, today's event is hybrid, and so before we get started, I want to check in with a few logistics. For folks on person and on Zoom who are participating by listening, how is my volume? Good in the room. Is it okay online, Angela?
It is okay. Yep, thanks for asking.
Okay. For folks in person and on Zoom who are using the site to participate, can you see me all right? Yes. Live professional captioning is available via the Zoom captions feature or the stream text link added in the chat. In-person participants can also pull up the stream text link on your personal devices. When our presenters begin, we will share any available access copies or materials digitally. There are also some in print right on that first table if anyone would like them. We want to encourage everyone to be in this space and in our digital space in whatever way best supports your engagement. That can include getting up, stimming, doing yoga, laying down, taking a break as you need it. Use the space as necessary. As part of that, if you're in person, please help yourself to drinks and refreshments, which include gluten and dairy-free options over on the table. I should also say they include caffeine, which seems especially important to you this time of day. Minnesota Transform is committed to making our events as inclusive and accessible as possible for all our community members, because health justice and disability justice are a part of racial justice and Indigenous sovereignty. We know that systemic inequity means that marginalized people and populations especially those who are negatively racialized, are more likely to experience disabling conditions than people in populations with more social privilege and resources. This, of course, includes the devastating impacts of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Masks are available if you need one. Thanks for helping us provide this important care for our community members who are immunocompromised, disabled, elderly, and caregivers. Are there any other access or support needs that folks would like to discuss right now? Okay. If something comes up during the event, don't hesitate to let us know so that we can pause and address those needs. Our next step in welcoming you all this afternoon is acknowledging that the University of Minnesota was not only built on unceded Dakota land, but built with the profits from selling thousands of acres of Dakota and Anishinaabe land. Both forms of injustice demand accountability and reparations, including but not limited to expanded accessibility to the UU's Native American Promise Tuition Program, sustained funding for the American Indian Studies Department and Native-led student groups, and a meaningful collaboration with Minnesota's 11 Native nations to self-determine what land back means regarding the 30,000 acres of land the university currently owns. Just last week, a 500-page report called Truth was released, detailing our university's role in Native dispossession and exploitation. We encourage you to review it and demand their reparations recommendations. You can have access and read the full Truth report at this Z link on our slide. It's also on our website, and we have hard copies of the executive summary out by the snacks at the end of today's session. Minnesota Transform is a major higher education initiative engaging anti-colonial and racial justice work through the public humanities at the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities and across the state of Minnesota. Supported by a Just Futures Mellon grant, Minnesota Transform puts the humanities on the front lines through numerous public and university partnerships and hundreds of student internships on racial justice. On campus, Minnesota Transform lays the groundwork for structural changes that expand the university's racial justice work. Minnesota Transform is part of and helps to support universities reckoning with racism, dispossession, and exclusion in ways that reimagine the university and elaborate its possibilities. We want to thank the Mellon Foundation, whose Just Futures initiative we are proud to be part of. The Institute for Advanced Study incubated this project and has been a crucial home for us ever since we began. And the Liberal Arts Engagement Hub has hosted many of our events this week. We're incredibly grateful for all of their help. We also want to thank the many staff, students, colleagues, and especially community members who joined our projects, who made things work, and whose energies have made this event and Minnesota Transform possible. Today's event is part of a week-long series of events that have highlighted the projects done by Minnesota Transform partners. Directly following this event, we will be co-hosting a roundtable in the Best Buy Theater, co-hosted with the Institute for Advanced Study. It's on the 4th floor of this building, called What to Do When They Tell You It Can't Be Done, which could be our motto. The roundtable will feature colleagues at other universities as well as from the University of Minnesota, discussing the challenges of doing ethical public engagement at universities and how we have in fact made it work. The talk goes from 3:30 until 5 and is followed by a reception. You are very welcome to join us for that event. Now, though, I would like to welcome you to Oral Histories for Racial and Indigenous Justice. This panel brings together several of our partners who were generous enough to share their time and insight to discuss their projects and the significance of oral histories for justice work in which their institutions and groups are engaged. So I will introduce people roughly in the order in which they're sitting on the stage and then on Zoom, and then we will begin the conversation. Kevin Murphy, at the far right of the table, is an award-winning scholar, teacher, and mentor in the history department, whose work also encompasses the departments of American Studies and Heritage Studies and Public History. He directs the university's Liberal Arts Engagement Hub, among many, many other tasks. Dr. Murphy is on the leadership team of Minnesota Transform and is an influential and innovative public historian. Mike Hoyt is an award-winning Kanaka Maoli artist who maintains a professional art practice living and working on Dakota homeland. The Day Ota Otunwe, the name is Chota Makoche, Minneapolis, Minnesota. He is also the creative community director at the Pillsbury House and Theater, where he manages PH&T's creative community development work, supporting more than 150 artists in over 130 community engaged art projects and initiatives. Speaking of making things work. He manages the McKnight Fellowships for Community Engaged Artists. Khoi Nguyen is a first-generation queer Vietnamese migrant. They are a PhD candidate in American Studies at the University of Minnesota, looking at the overlapping relationship between Vietnamese refugees and queerness. Macey Flood is an herbalist, parent, and historian. They are currently a postdoc with Boston University's Center for Anti-Racist Research and an affiliated researcher with the program in the history of science, technology, and medicine at the University of Minnesota. They live in South Minneapolis with their family. Finally, Emily Beck is a parent, special collections librarian, and historian. She is the assistant curator of the Lincoln Historical Library of Biology and Medicine, and is an affiliate faculty member in the history department and in the program on the history of science, technology, and medicine at the University of Minnesota. She lives and gardens in St. Anthony Village with her family. Thank you all very much for your time. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Tracy. Thanks everyone for being here, and to the panelists. I'm really pleased and honored to be able to moderate this conversation. We provided some prompts to the panelists today before today's roundtable, and they've been preparing some responses to those, but we're also looking that there is a lot of time for engagement with the audience. So I think the way we can proceed is I can read out one of the prompts, and then you all can respond as in the order that you choose, and then feel free to engage with one another too in conversation before we move on to the next day. So the first cluster of questions. How did you carry out, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. First, I think you're going to say a few things about the project. Is that right?
Yes, and first, I'm so sorry.
Sorry.
One of our panelists is joining us on Zoom. And
Oh, you didn't introduce, okay.
I do. So we're gonna just,
Yeah.
this is how we get things done. I'm so sorry, Edward Barber is joining us on Zoom. He is a past resident of Glendale Townhomes, whose mother was on the board president and is a crucial community leader. Mr. Barber is an important contributor to Defend Glendale's Oral History Project. Minnesota Transform is doing a big project with Glendale Townhomes with the group Defend Glendale, who is working to empower the residents of the public housing complex in Glendale Townhomes. That work is led by Ladin Youssef. Ladin couldn't be with us today, which we really regret, but we're really glad that Edward can be here and talk about that project.
Great, thanks. And so, yeah, let's start off just hearing a little bit about the projects that you do. Mike, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Thanks for having me, everyone.
There's a microphone in the middle of the table. It might be helpful for you to use that.
Oh, that. Flip it on or is it there?
I think you can hold it. You can just hold
Okay,
it, yeah.
great. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Hoyt. I begin pronouns. I'm from the Philly House and Theater in South Minneapolis. And so over the past almost 18 months now, we've been working with PhD candidate history Frederick Tinsley to do an oral history project about community members in a broad sense that have been part of our work, our ongoing work for the past 30 years. We celebrated our 30th anniversary this past year as an organization. But we also are part of United Communities, with actually 145-year-old organization. So very, very old and complicated organization, as you can imagine, being that old in Minnesota. So Trevor conducted an immense amount of interviews with people. A lot of them are artists that we've been engaged with, community members, folks that have been engaged in our programs, or call our location sort of a creative home.
Hi everyone, I'm Khoi, I'm a PhD candidate in American Studies. I go by JP. I was able to work with the Liveness Project. A little bit about the Liveness Project is a coalition built by and for HIV and AIDS folks who've been impacted by HIV and AIDS in 1985. And ever since they initially started in 38 and close to the freeway, I want to say like Portland area. I'm blanking out on the cross street because it's been a while since with the geography, but currently they're in Nicollet and 38 within the last less than a decade or so. So this new location able to expand the space with the community member, providing not only food shelter, but hot food that is often not available to most community service providers. And through the Oral History Project, we were able to interview 36 folks of color who are a member of the Likeness Project, just retelling their story and their relationship with Minnesota and what it was like to not only be a part of the Likeness Project, but to be a part of Minnesota and seeing it transform over the last couple of decades, and how this was able to reshape the narrative, building on work like Kevin Murphy and Jennifer Pierce of Queer Twin City to ground what does queerness and people of color history looks like when we get to actually tell those stories and tell that story that's often missing. And one of the most impactful projects for me is oftentimes HIV and AIDS history is told through the coast. So for the first time, this is one of the few projects that ground us in Minnesota, and particularly the Midwest, and asking us, what does it mean to look at this history and to challenge that narrative that unravel what is the dominant narrative, who get to tell these stories, not only racially, but geographically as well.
Hey everybody, I hope you can hear me okay. I'm Macey Flood. I use both they and she pronouns. I'm a Euro-descended researcher and historian. I got my PhD here a couple of years ago in history of medicine. I'm sitting with my dear and beloved friend, Emily. Speak louder. Okay.
No, it's at the top.
That makes sense.
Sorry.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, I'll say some pieces of that again. I'm Macey Flood. It's good to see everybody, and it's really an honor to be here. Thank you. I'm sitting with Emily, and I'll introduce a little bit of our project. We work on a project called Plant People, which is an oral history project on human-plant relations mostly in the Twin Cities, but also in surrounding parts of Minnesota, broadly speaking. This project isn't actually affiliated with any of our university research, nor is it affiliated with any like organizations specifically, in that we are partners with many different individuals and participants of Plant People in communities who are themselves like situated more or less within organizations that have variously longstanding commitments to environmental and racial and social justice, as well as like kind of the support of teaching and holding different types of plant-based knowledge over time. And this project came out initially not from oral history research, but more from just like folks we knew. I'm an herbalist, and Emily is a gardener, and we, over the past 10 years, actually did other sorts of work in herbal history with herbalists locally who have been, through conversation and various types of collaborations, asked for like a more pointed effort in like documenting and recording oral history specific to botanical medicine in this region. And similarly, like, one of our investments is in telling a story that often is also very coastal. There's a lot of conversation about like a resurgence of herbalism happening in the 1960s and 1970s on one of the two coasts. And we're both committed to like situating that somewhat differently and documenting what's specific and special about here. And also opening up that conversation more broadly to like the ways in which Indigenous and racial justice movements actually are one of the bedrocks of why we think this place has so many plant people and so many kind of like notable institutional and legislative firsts actually regarding plant medicine. So I don't know, is there anything else I forgot? So thus far in the last year, we've done about maybe 45 interviews, and we're supposed to do about 20 more in the months to come.
Great, thank you. Edward, do you want to share on Glendale project?
Yes, my name is Edward Barber, and I'm a past resident of Glendale Townhomes. My mother was politically activated in Glendale. She was a former Glendale president of the resident council. And I'm just here to share my story with each and every one of you.
Excellent, thank you so much. All right, so the first cluster of questions for the panelists is, can you tell us a little bit more about how you carried out your project and what you needed in order to do that, to carry it out? What was the process of collecting oral histories like? I'm assuming you're not all going to answer all of these questions, but some of them. How did you identify people? And how did you approach them to share their stories? And finally, how did you handle issues of privacy and control of knowledge? And I realize these are ongoing projects, so I'll move that from the past tense. Who'd like to start?
We can start since we were holding it. You did. Edward, did you want, we can't see you, so if you want to jump in, we don't know, so.
Yeah, I tried to click on the video, but it says you cannot start your video because the host has disabled it.
Edward?
Angela,
Yep, I'm on it. I'm gonna see if I can get that figured out for you, Edward. Sorry about that.
great.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Angela. And then Edward, once the video's going, we can bring you back into the conversation. How's that? All right. Thanks, Judy.
Let's do it again. Yeah, thank you. We run this project with Emily. I feel like this is a good, we're jumping off point because that's where we stopped. Our project, Plant People runs through like, and it's really centered on relations. And in fact, the only way that has worked and continues to function is from knowing folks for a long period of time, and proceeding like really gently and slowly from relationships within plant-based communities. And this is like in large part, and I believe it will surprise the folks here because like in various different ways. Many plant people, and especially like herbalists or foragers or other folks of with deep plant health relations, especially from racially like minoritized or indigenous descent, have like deep, incredible distrust of university research, generally speaking, or any research that could end up with like knowledge, like moving towards extractive processes. Like many people are concerned about bioprospecting and the possibilities of pharmaceutical companies or others making financial gain. So those are some of the issues of privacy and security that like have kind of underlying scope this project. And so we have never, this isn't, our project isn't, and our conversations are explicitly not about asking for like information about plants. They're conversations about like people's life stories, and what they want to bring. And in that regard, like, the folks that we talk to then connect us with others that they think we should talk to, and they connect us with others that they should talk to. And in that way, our work has been able to build, go extremely slowly and work through, like, ideally enough trust and rapport that we can build in a lot of like participation, and participation isn't even quite the right word, but like guidance, yeah, guidance, feedback, like multiple iterations of like, what should we do next? Who should we talk to next? What should these forms look like? What do you want us to do with this conversation? Et cetera. So this, and yeah.
So for the likeness project, there was 2 graduate assistants who started, Danielle Brown and I. Danielle had to step back, and eventually I took over the project to start the interview. So with most processes, kind of unexpected and uneven in terms of the timeline. It took us a while to actually get the project off and actually sit down and talk with folks. Then through the interview process, it's literally a month for 30-something interviews. So it was a lot of time setting up with the community. Kevin was able to have many years relationship with Likeness to begin with. So that was already the foundation for building the trust level between the Likeness and the university. Through the funding, Danielle and I came on as the oral history conductor reporter. And Hannah, who is the admin at Aliveness, were pretty much essential to the entire project, where she was the person who put us in contact with a lot of the members. Even when Danielle and I would just sit and hang out at the cafeteria to meet folks, we're still known as the stranger, the university who just like lurk around the cafeteria and ask for participants. So Hannah actually were the one that assured folks that these are long building relationship that we pre-existing, and the 2 of us were part of that project to record and make sure that these stories are handled with care. So through that process, I learned how you never really expect things to go smoothly, always expect the unexpected. So you could sit there for 3-4 months. And we started, I believe, in October, and we sat until post-Christmas, and just waiting not only for material, but the reporter, and then getting people to sign up and all that logistic. And within that spring semester, I were able to talk with folks, and slowly through snowballing, once you have a couple of folks who trust you enough, they would tell their friends throughout the cafeteria. And that's one of the best part about Aliveness itself, not only providing the warm food, but providing the community setting that not only create a warm space, but a space where you could actually talk to folks post-interview as well. So a lot of times I would just spend the meal, the interview is only an hour long, but the meal before or after could potentially be the additional hour that to assure them this is a safe space, that this is, the story will be taken care of with the handle with care. So.
I think that our project really, it took some time to evolve, and I think that was through the intentional process of inviting Treasure in to just be in relationship with us and our partners. We were still in the pandemic, and so how we operated as a fairly radically porous neighborhood center felt really closed off for a period of time, as many people experienced. And so as we are reimagining and trying to understand how to be open again to the public and be responsive to our community and our neighbors, Treasure started to come in and participate in just being engaged with another partnership that was blossoming at the time, which was a new partnership with Leslie Parker Dance. And so they were developing an exhibit and a performance called Call to Remember. And Treasure came and participated in those workshops and was in dialogue and conversation and helped think through and was curious about how is racial justice centered in the work of artists in community, particularly majority BIPOC community, also in an organization that has historically been BIPOC led. And I think eventually we landed on the oral history project because part of what our challenge has been for the past 30 years is, BIPOC-led organizations embedded in communities of color are historically under-researched. These histories and stories are undertold. And because we're a hybrid organization, we're an arts organization, but we run the childcare day programs for adults with disabilities, a bike shop that employs unhoused youth. We do a lot of different things, and one of our struggles is that it's hard to talk about our work. We sort of defy reduction in a way. And so we felt like the Oral History Project was an opportunity for us to listen to our community and to better understand the threads and the connections that may be made across people's experiences in connection to the organization. Over the years, many people have walked in off the street and said, I used to go to Glory House, or I was in the childcare there, or I did something on your stage. Everyone has a story about the Pillsbury, but we had no way to aggregate or collect those stories in a way that could help us understand our work even, and how to continue to be in the right relationship with our community. So we felt like this was an opportunity to do that.
Great, thank you. Edward?
Yes. My process was collecting oral history was to think about some of the people who I knew that were on the committee when my mother was president, to track them down and speak with them to see what they had to contribute at that time in history. To find out if they were willing to come forward and talk about how it was back in the 60s and 70s, living in public housing and trying to improve it, make it better for everyone. That's pretty much it for that question.
All right, thanks very much. So I want to move on to some questions about resources. I mean, these kinds of projects can be very difficult to launch and to sustain and require human resources, money, equipment, all of those kinds of things. So if you could talk to us about sort of what resources were helpful for you on this project, and what resources did you need that you learned that you needed as you conducted the project? And maybe tell us a little bit about what this project required from your organization or the organization you worked with in order to sort of support it as you moved along.
Thank you. So I think having and being in relationship with a dedicated researcher who provided immense labor and work for our organization, our community was something that as a somewhat small nonprofit organization would be incredibly challenging. That we often as a nonprofit working in a nonprofit industrial complex, we do a lot of reporting. We count things, but we don't do it in sort of a ethnographic qualitative way. Most of our reporting is for to make sure that we've lived up to the promises that we've made around using resources. And so that was a very useful and has been a very useful process for us, and also setting up methodologies and platforms for us to continue to do the work, and to think about how what Treasure established could be led by young people in our community through more intergenerational approaches, how it could lead to skill development and media access. And I think working with the University of Minnesota, we also were able to get some resources to I guess do a commission, or to do a call for artists to do a commission to actually extend the work through a public art project from a community-based artist. So what would it mean to also work with an artist that we're in a relationship with in our community to then interpret the oral histories through their whatever the discipline is, and how is that also a way for us to share threads of these narratives and our narrative justice work back to the community. So it's been a really rich opportunity, and we think it will continue to bear fruit.
Great. Just to interrupt for 1 second, I wanted to point out that Treasure is Treasure Tinsley, who's here in the audience, who's a PhD student in history, public historian, and someone who's contributed in really big ways to Minnesota Transform. So, yeah. What?
So definitely have institutional support really took the able to take this project off the ground, where not only the financial support where we were able to provide to the interviewee, to acknowledge that their story actually is a lot more than just $100 gift card, but it's something for us to start with in terms of allowing that resource to go directly back into the community itself. And Minnesota Transform completely aided this project and moved this project along the way, in a way where it would be possible, but much more slower. It was just community-based, or just by myself, asking for folks for story, and not having like the mic, the reporters, not having access to the treasure collection, because prior to me, Tan Cook also did a comprehensive survey of the treasure collection for the likeness project. So this creates a foundation in terms of institutional support that came through Minnesota Transform. So having those minor things really set up the foundation for me to just go in, able to talk to folks. Danielle and I were able to write up a brief intros to talk about the project itself in a very concentrated manner. So having those things really helpful, and then having Denise providing not only books, but like transcription programs. That took a while for us to not only locate the right transcription program to get the subscription and all that. So those minor things are just like $100 here, $1,000 there. Eventually, pretty much were the foundation of the project. And as much as we don't want to rely on the financial institution or the financial foundation or support, but it really shaped the project or the timeline of the project itself. So, and it allows the community to actually draw in a lot of folks. So that's a lot. It is a reality where people were really not the $100 doesn't do much, but it's enough for them to have access to just minor things just around the house or just things that we might not even expect. We thought about transportation as well, because 38 Nicollet is a little bit far out the way if you're in St. Paul. So having that two-stop transfer from St. Paul is completely hard for folks just coming in for an hour interview. So those are the things that we want to acknowledge, and even just $100 just to acknowledge that work and personal commission on both.
Excellent. And to interject once again, Denise is Denise Pike, who's the project manager for Minnesota Transform, who's here in the back. In addition to being really impressive public and oral historian, Denise has done so much to connect Minnesota Transform partners and projects to resources. Oftentimes that's been really challenging to do. So I just wanted to point that out and call attention to that. Thanks. Go ahead.
We have learned at every stage of this project that we need other things. It's been true learning like all the time. We've been super fortunate to be supported in addition to Minnesota Transform by the Institute of the Environment here for you, as well as the Minnesota Historical Society. And through all of those, it's been a lot of equipment, which is so excellent, and also resources that give us more time. And I think that has been like such a learning curve for us, that we need, like, the interns from Minnesota Transform have been so essential to help us with processing transcripts. We needed, have really been helped by having some extra financial contributions for better transcription. We were doing automated transcription at first, and the difference between automated and an actual human being is amazing. So that's been wonderful. We've needed a lot of mentoring. So we have learned a ton from our interviewees and tried to invite and really listen when people give us advice about or recommendations about ways that we can shift our process. You know, great questions that they think we should be able to answer. Has been wonderful. We have been able to give our interviewees an honorarium to thank them for participating. And we've also learned that people really seem to appreciate having other gifts as well. So we try our best to always bring, if it's the summer, I bring flowers from my garden, or one of us will cook something, or we'll have a meal together. And that seems like that's been a really wonderful way to build sort of relationality and trust.
Yeah. I feel like that the piece of like tiny grant, like what seems like a really small amount of money at first. Like I feel like the first grant that we were supported by from IME was one of their mini grants, and it was like $1,500. And we were like a slightly larger collaborative at the time, and it's still like, I know in the world of granting it's so little of being able to tell folks like we can give you $100 and we can. That's why we had the terrible automated transcription at the time, but it like even like just enough to feel like there was like some purpose and momentum, and then enough also for us to then move from there to be like, okay, we have a reason. We can reasonably say to the Minnesota Historical Society, please can we have like a little tiny bit more, and then we can like offer like more to, you know, to people who are recognized elders in the community, or we can have somebody actually help us with audio books or something, instead of trying to do the work, you know, that would take longer for us to do, and we do a worse job of it anyway. Yeah.
Thanks, Edward.
Yes, first I'd like to say that for those of you that don't know, there's a push going on throughout the United States to get rid of public housing. And Glendale Townhomes community is located southeast Minneapolis, in between two major downtowns, Minneapolis and St. Paul, on the doorsteps of the University of Minnesota, on the doorsteps of the light rail, also on the doorsteps of all the major sports stadiums and multi-businesses. And there's a big push to get rid of public housing. Glendale Community Center is what they consider a gold mine. because it's considered a upscale housing community for low income. And they want to demolish it and put in high rises, condos, and things like that. So that's why I joined on the board to save Glendale. Now, my resources was the Minneapolis Public Library, networking with people who I knew and grew up with, and that their parents and past family members were on the committee just like my mother was. And that's why I support Glendale and public housing to make sure that it exists today, tomorrow, and forever.
Thank you. And Glendale, Defend Glendale is creating an exhibition that focuses on the history of Glendale and ties it to the present and to the issues I think that Edward's raising. And that's on Saturday, May 13th.
Yeah.
And yeah. Anything else you want to say about that event, Edward?
Yeah, Saturday, May 13th is the 70th year of the existence of Glendale public housing. And it's going to be a fantastic event. We have several charts and the history of Glendale, how it originally started, what it was for, and I just found out recently how it started. I was going to save that for the next question, but I'll tell you now. It was originally started for World War II veterans, which I never knew. And then it switched over to public housing, and it's been public housing for 70 years now. And once again, we're May 13th, we're going to have a big celebration, food, speakers, music, and we would really like each and every one of you to come out and join us.
Excellent, thank you. And we'll have information about that event on the Minnesota Transform website for anybody who's interested. Thanks.
Thank you.
So, yeah, thank you. So oral history is a particular research methodology that produces knowledge that's really different from other kinds of research, like archival research, for example. And so I think wondering what it is you all think you've learned from using this methodology in your project. What have you learned about your neighborhoods, the history of the organizations that you're working with, if that's been a topic? And are there any stories that struck you as especially compelling? And I want to add something on here that wasn't said to you in advance of other questions. What do you think the people that you interviewed and engaged with might have learned through the process of engaging with you and contributing oral histories, if you have any thoughts about that? Because that's one of the really wonderful things about oral history, is that the learning happens in both directions, right? Anybody want to start? Go ahead.
So I often just learn about oral history through reading, because as a student, you're kind of forced to read 1,000 books on one particular method. So for the first time diving into an oral history that's not just talking with my family or informal community member and there's a mic, and knowing that this will exist forever in an archive with my voice attached to a story. It's really intimidating at first. So as I'm transcribing, I could hear chronically through from the beginning to the end, I could hear my voice shake a lot less by the time, and we laugh a lot more. So by the time at the end of the last couple of interviews, we pretty much just sit there and laugh the entire time, talk about anything that they want to come up, that they want to bring up. What stood out to me is a lot of the community members don't get to access their family on a regular, so these become time capsules for them. So they directly speak to their family in these archival recording. So that really hit home to me in terms of what does it mean to uncover your own history. And I often imagine if I were a great grandchild discovering my grandparents' story for the first time, that even my parents don't have access to this. What's that mean? Being a person who immigrated to the US, I often don't have story of Vietnam that is not written from a Vietnamese perspective, right? So hearing these stories is very much translated to a very human experience itself, where oftentimes we're seeking out these stories that relate to us and allow us to understand who we are. And I think just learning to relax and let that process flow comes out a lot more for both of us. And even outside the interview process, I learned fun things like the cafeteria seating is very much very parallel to how you imagine high school. It's very click, right? And it got to a point where it's like, oh, so it informed how I later on asked questions like, how did this show up for you? What does this look like for you? What does the racial formation actually play out in terms of like who gets to sit at what table? And what wave of dining do people go in and how do they time it? So those things that allow you to not only build relationships, but over time just relax and have fun. Those stories come out a lot more naturally. So learning about that is really important. And one of the most crucial things that the likeness provides the warm meal, and I keep pushing that because a lot of these members live in multiple major cities like Chicago, San Francisco, New York. They don't provide hot meal the same way that a likeness does. So being that we don't get to record our own story, an important aspect like this, not even recorded, and people don't know the important resource that we provide, that this is one of the few HIV/AIDS center that actually provide free hot meal pre-COVID, right? Even during COVID, people get to take it home. It's still warm food. And this is something that a lot of coastal city can't provide because of their mass numbers. And because we have a much more smaller community that we have direct impact, the number always talk about how that impact them. Just having a warm meal that feel a little less isolating, they just feel like it's a little personal made for them. So something like that really show up in terms of like the method itself, allow to see like the human aspect of it.
Thanks. Well, we learned a lot and we are still learning and we'll be learning more tomorrow. Part of our large organization, Rosemary 1980, which we're part of, we have sort of 3 community storytelling platforms. We have a KRSM radio in Phillips neighborhood that has roughly 60 community hosts providing programming every week. We have North News, which is a newspaper run by young people of North High School. And then we have the theater. And I feel like a lot of what we do is community storytelling or narrative justice work. But I think what we've learned and are continuing to learn through this process is that we haven't really focused that work internally to try to understand what we do and why we do it. And I think that that's been really useful and continues to be useful in reckoning with how to be accountable to the community and do the right work. Some of what's been really valuable in Treasure's research is learning about the history of Filipino communities, particularly you see at Riverside, prior to 1980 when our building was built and our organization, our theater sort of was founded. But in Filipino communities, there's a very problematic history in relationship to the development of the Riverside plazas and the freeway expansion. And a lot of times community organizations like ours either are complicit in or get used as a proxy for community dreams or wishes, right? And so we're trying to also be cognizant of those histories so that we don't continue to make those mistakes as a somewhat, representative of a neighborhood or neighbors or a body of people, that we could never fully be representative of. And part of what we're also learning is that those histories are somewhat opaque and inaccessible to ourselves and our neighbors, right? So we're thinking a lot about like, well, what does it mean to hold or to share our collective histories in a way that's accessible to the community? And do we have to play a role in that? As a multiracial producing, organizing space for artists, one of the common threads that has been emerging as I listen to a lot of the interviews and read through them is that, a lot of the people that are impacted by the work or that have come up through our organization really have been sort of touched by the lineages of Black and Black queer feminist practice. But there isn't necessarily an archive of that influence, of that lineage of artists that have come through our organization or that have deeply impacted hundreds of artists in our community. And so being aware of that and being aware of those threads of that, it challenges us to think about what our responsibility is to hold that and to share that so that we can inform how these sorts of spark artists in the future as well. And, artists and community members as well.
Edward, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you. Like I said before, one thing that I learned was that Glendale was originally built for World War II veterans. Another thing that I really learned from it was the meaning of it takes a village to raise a child. And what I mean by that, with Glendale Council, even back in the 60s, there were no major grocery stores within a mile. So they opened up a co-op store there. They also had a vaccine day to where children could come in and get their vaccines. And they also had a daycare. I might have said it already. A daycare for the women to bring their kids to, so they could seek work. A lot of things about Glendale is because of the resident council that they formed together and stepped up to make Glendale not just low income, but a productive neighborhood in Minneapolis. And like I said, I remember when I was a kid, my mother took us to vaccine day, and we would upgrade our shots to the co-op store. You didn't have to catch a cab, catch a bus, anything like that. Through the resident council, I was able to get my first job at the age of 13 because they brought a program there called NYC, which was Neighborhood Youth Corps. And when I got my first job, I was working for public housing. I was working with the painters and the carpenters. And that's why I feel so strongly about preserving public housing in the state of Minnesota. Thank you.
Thank you. Macey and Emily.
Okay. You've learned a lot of things. It's interesting to have you position that in like the framework of oral history as a question, particularly like as we go along. We've been wondering more and more like what is an oral history and what is like a life story or like a recorded conversation. Yeah, well, for real. And actually, like just recently we have been talking about like, are we doing oral history anymore? But it seems really related to the kinds of stories that people want to tell, especially like sometimes folks spend a lot of time on their childhood and their memories of playing in the mud. And sometimes people come in and talk about a dream, and then that whole conversation goes around the dream and then comes back around to like where they're living now. And sometimes someone is very linear and is like, I grew up here and then I went here and I studied here, and this is where I am today, and is that what you wanted to know? You know, like there's such a breadth of ways that people marry or want to narrate their lives. So that's a space of learning for us for sure, and has been sitting in kind of a curious way around like what does it mean to be studying history in this context, or the way that history is really alive and moving in the present for the people that we're talking to. And I feel like the other piece that I really want to bring forward, and then I'll pass it to you, Emily, is like we went in being like, we're gonna talk to herbalists, and like I had a very narrow and my own like cultural perspective, be like what that even meant, and like almost right off the bat, people were like, okay, actually, you should be talking to this person who's doing ecology, this person who's non-tenant, this person who's doing foraging, and this basket maker. And so, and those were the folks that others in their communities were identifying as being in these like radical, very culturally, spiritually, and deeply connected relations with plants that had to do with health, because that was our other like viewpoint. And so I think like we knew that health was broad, and we keep learning in another way. And I think that's something that gets articulated in the conversations with the folks that we talk to too, that there's a really dialectical process of people saying, well, by the way, this is what I think health is. That then, it's like, I wouldn't say we're figuring out together because they know a lot more than us, but it's like it's getting articulated together.
Well, and I think that's felt really important to be able to push ourselves to be as flexible as possible with the folks that we're interviewing, like in the interviews, but also deciding who we're going to speak with. Partly because we both came out of a graduate program here at the U, and I work at the U in libraries. And so I was super familiar with these systems of power that like completely prioritize biomedicine and that particular way of knowing. And you know, myself being in the library, seeing how this power structure that prioritizes that way of knowing, and all of these other ways of knowing that have been excluded deliberately or inadvertently from the resources. And so for us to be able to say like, sure, like I guess a basket maker is someone who we should speak with. That's not who I thought we would be speaking with either, but to be able to be flexible in sort of creating a set of resources or encouraging the creation of a set of resources that will speak to health as something that can be like as broadly defined as the people we're speaking with want it to be defined.
Thank you. Before we open the conversation up to the audience and give the panelists a chance to ask each other questions, there's one more set of questions that I want to pose to you, and that has to do with what happens to the oral histories once you've collected them and made them available. How do you think the project, the oral histories you've collected, will get used moving forward? How will you share those oral histories to community members and to others? How do you see these oral histories playing into other projects you do or the goals of the organization you're working
This thing's getting a lot of use, a lot of passion. Well, I think as I mentioned before, we are going to be commissioning this community artist project to sort of lift up components of and embed it in or around our building so that it's accessible to folks that are in relationship to that space that are entering our building. The work is available online in both audio and text transcript. But I think it's also, we're trying to understand how to use this as a tool to learn for ourselves. So what does it reflect back to us about our practice, whether it be equitable or inequitable? How can we learn about systems and structures that we created that can be dismantled so that we can be in better relationship with community. And I think these stories actually are valuable information for them. And then I think, not just I think sometimes we are often in balance with trying to solve problems all the time, but not really scaling success. And so if we lean towards scaling success, how do we think about this platform of storytelling and oral history as a way to reimagine our work with community? So if we're planning a block party this summer and we're elevating the beautiful work of Janella Petrus and her children's book, please give police stations to the grandmothers, buy that book, please. How does this component of storytelling, oral history, lift up stories of grandmothers in our community? What does it mean to be loved and not policed? And are there ways that we can use the research and story collection methods that Treasure developed to also integrate that into the work that we want to lift up and celebrate in our community? And so I think those are the ways that we're trying to think about it in sort of a generative ways, I guess, and creative ways.
We're starting the oral history project. We were very clear in terms of this is accessible to the community. One thing is the likeness coming up to their 40th anniversary. So we asked the member right before we interviewed if we could showcase some of the short clips or something to show that this is our community. This is the community that the likeness is serving. So those are some of the immediate possibility, or thinking through the cookbook notion of all the food that's been served through a likeness and how that can be created accessible to the community. But one of the larger projects that we started thinking about in terms of like how can oral history be interviewed among community members? So it's not gatekeeping where a university person have to come in with equipment and we have to sit in a confined room and only the university person could conduct this formal interview. So we're trying to think through different ways. And this has been on the back burner for a little bit in terms of like how can we just have access for community just to sit down and interview each other or in a group setting. Is that still oral history? If it's just 10 people sitting around laughing for an hour. So those are the doors that's been opening in terms of this project itself, thinking how can other folks just interview each other or a community member creating a space for themselves. We are building on a website in a potential way where it's very accessible, very low key. It's just transcript and the recording itself, so it's accessible to the community. This is way future in the project, but something that I would love to have accessible to the larger community in that sense, where this is not just for the treasure collection and another check mark on our or a pattern on our back, but it's something that people could access. These stories are directly addressing their family member. How can their family member actually access this at any point? But also respecting privacy at the same time. If any story wants to be told anytime, that is also part of it. So thinking about the futurity of that project, of that notion itself, not only the longevity, but the privacy of the person, if they want to preserve a story in a certain manner or whatnot. So that's on that one.
Edward, do you want to go?
Yes, for me, as far as looking forward, during the May 13th celebration, we'll have 15 panels of information, visual information that people can look at and read that explains the history, people who've lived there, what they've learned, friends, families, and everything that they have experienced, and to wake up the city of Minneapolis and the state of Minnesota on what's going on behind closed doors as far as trying to eliminate public housing. this celebration will open their eyes up, and hopefully it will be able to move forward with other people to get on board and to recognize what's going on throughout the city and throughout the United States with public housing. Thank you.
Thanks.
So some practical things that I think we're doing for the project going forward, we're working on building a website, that will be up eventually. We keep, it's like everything, it's never done, right? We keep editing it. But to put the interviews with their transcripts and audio files up online so that they are accessible to folks. As soon as we finish the transcripts, we send those out to our interviewees at least. One of our interns right now is working on a project, like you alluded to, right, the creating resources so that folks in community can do this as well without our intervention, should they choose to. So those can be kept internal or just used however they would like to. How facility is, I think we don't totally know. We're not done yet. Will it ever be done? We have ideas and visions. Can I talk about our ideas and visions with you?
Like there's so many, like the people are touch so many different organizations and there's so many amazing groups. Like I feel like I shouldn't be here, like all these interviews should be here, then they should be speaking and we'd all be crying. And that's what happens. And that's like really what is there. And part of that is because like there's so much soul and heart and like beauty, and also because they because I feel that these stories and the people that are telling them really demonstrate how like loving and joyful relations with plant and space like can sit in like a joyful, productive, nourishing way at the center of like racial and indigenous justice movements and like environmental and social and health justice in so many ways. So I think we hope to keep like figuring out like how can we activate in a way that also preserves integrity and like and keeps it like to the process and the people that we're in relation with. And we have some real questions around privacy too, and like what does it mean to have something go on the internet, and then like when do we continue to maintain control over what can be redacted and when it can be redacted, and how are we going to productively work with digital archiving, which is sort of our next step also in like in ways that we think again like keep intellectual property rights within the culture norms that share the stories themselves, and also I don't know, honor accession agreements. I mean things that we don't know yet and we're learning over time. And I'm actually really curious to hear everyone else speak to like how are you figuring out those processes? Have you been figuring out them? Have they been changing over time? What forms do you use? Who do you work with? Because we are like right now we have things on online story maps attached to the University of Minnesota, and we don't want to like that's feels to me like not digitally a good long-term plan. Like it would, that platform will change. We will die, you know, so it's not gonna last forever. So we have many questions there also.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's one place to start before we open to the audience, since you're posing this question to your fellow panelists, that there are ethical issues with all research, community-based research, and there are particular ones with oral history. Making sure that you're offering participants the opportunity to be confidential, to be anonymous, to take back their oral histories if they don't want to share them, all of those kinds of issues. And then there's the sort of issue about like where it lives, who owns that this, and given that digital platforms are changing all the time, these are really big concerns. So I'm glad you brought it up. Does anybody else on the panel want to address those?
I mean, I think I would mostly throw this to Treasure, but there was a process around consent, and I think he won't speak specifically to that. I'm sorry, I don't mean to put you on the spot, because I know, obviously.
I think you have to switch it on.
Yeah, okay. Hold on. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really complicated question. I think that, it's not something that we've like fully figured out yet, to be quite honest. We have a consent form that is very clear that, our informants and narrators have total ownership over their materials. And that, for us means that we haven't found an archive yet that we can keep them in long term. And that's something that we have to figure out as we go forward. It means that we will most likely try to work with a community archive where, I mean, and this has already happened where we've had narrators and interviewees who have said, I want you to redact that. I want that taken out. I want to change this. I want to be re-interviewed. And that's a part of our process. And I think our process is going to change as well. I think we've learned a lot. We have had some, I think, some practices that we want to change. And I think one of those, actually, as you were speaking, I was thinking about like our consent form right now, doesn't make it clear that like once, I mean, it is clear on there, but maybe could be more explicit that like once something is on the internet and is available, like we will always take it down if you ask us to. We will always do deaccessioning in any way or redaction, but that doesn't necessarily change the copies that are out there. So I think we could actually be more clear on that front. But yeah, we haven't found an archive yet. There's a archive that is in the process of kind of getting off the ground right now, community archive that one of the co-directors of Pillsbury House is helping to found alongside artists here, and I think that's the most likely place that we're hoping to end up as kind of a collection that can also serve that archive to get off the ground and start with that collection as well. So.
Great. Yeah, and I think one of the other sort of thorny things that we still haven't really thought through is, aside from the individuals who've been interviewed and their stories have been collected, who gets to make meaning of the work, right? And is it just us? Is it just our organization who's benefited from this partnership? How does community get to really make meaning of it so that it informs our assumptions or our beliefs? That's another huge door.
We were fortunate enough to start the project knowing that we settle in the treasure collection. So we knew and we were able to tell the participants that this is where it lives, if you're comfortable with it, and this is where you could potentially access, and if you don't want to, we could pull at any time. There's institutional support that traditionally university will hold up to 100 years and then they keep renewing. So we don't know how long it will exist. As long as the university exists, if the treasure collection exists, your story will live. And over this last year, we did have one story request to be told. So at this moment, I'm still transcribing and whatnot, so it's easier for us to pull that out of the collection. But for us to think about in terms of like even the different files, like the raw material of file that we recorded and then to edit it down, what version do we keep and what version is stored even, and then which one is accessible to the public, right? And so even just as simple as like the version itself, like, and something as simple as like the consent form, it's supposed to not be public access at all because it has a lot of personal information, but who holds on to it right now? So it's just in a trusted hand at this moment, but it's those minor things that are still part of the conversation and thinking through, like, what does it mean to have these actual things floating around? And it's not in the safe that we like to ensure people that it's in a Fort Knox kind of security. And it's just like, it's in a very safe spot at the likeness. It's locked away, but it's still not Fort Knox. So those, we're still very much thinking through in terms of like public access, who have access to this, because talking about HIV and AIDS is very much directly linked to a medical history. The medical history then has repercussions that keep rippling out that can potentially be very bad. it's no longer have the stigma that it used to, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have a negative implication on the person, mental health or like just daily life. So things like that, we're still thinking through and make sure that we're very considerate and thoughtful through that process.
Edward, did you want to weigh in on these questions?
No, I don't have too many questions. I have another meeting I have to go to, so I would like to thank you guys for letting me come in and learn quite a bit. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Hi, thank you all so much for this. It's really, really interesting. And this is kind of extending the last question. And it's something that occurred to me actually when you initially brought up this question of people deciding, no, I want to pull it. What happens when the actual interviewee has died? And then you have family members coming up and saying, no, don't want that anymore. I mean, is this something that you have to put into your planning also?
Actually have not considered that at this moment. So that's a very important question in terms of who gets to control or access this once the primary person is no longer with us or deciding off their rights to another person. I think it requires a lot more discussion, but we still we honor and respect that. By pulling that story or setting it aside and then having a discussion, while the division will meet at least. But I think it also have us to decide whose story to, unless we have a written notice that agree that whatever the person decide or their family decide is final, then we will have to respect that. Otherwise, we would have to decide if this is what the original participant intention, or is this their family intention? So I think that is a larger question that we have not prepared for you. Something. Yeah. Because jumping pretty much in like the queer history itself, in this notion of how queerness is being navigated. And I think that's something that does pop up in terms of who gets to be holding the reservoir of the story, as the treasure collection is known as the Gay, Lesbian, Queer collection. That has implication and not all our interviewee identify as queer or on the spectrum. So this is something that they agree initially. So I think that is require a longer discussion when that surface and imagine it's not fit.
Okay, Elias.
Thank you. I have two related questions. One, and I'm bad with names, so the person in the black, yes. Just that conversation about, are you doing oral history? Curious about what you called what you were doing to the participant. Did you tell them, and this is for any of you, would you like to be part of an oral history project, or did you call it something else? But the related question, thinking about if you have a group of people who are in conversation and one of those people decides, I want to retract what I said. It's easy to do if it's just an interview with one person or a conversation with one person. What do you do if there's a group of people, but one of them decides they don't want their comments to be part of the record? What does that look like? I'm just curious how you navigate it. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. Yes, we called it an oral history project, and we were like, that. Yeah, this is the plan. People oral history projects, and it's going to be oral histories, which is actually like a little funny that in some ways, like, many people sort of stepped into, like, in the way the conversation flowed, has stepped into such different spaces. I think they've changed it recently.
feel like recently we've been approaching, I mean, you can already tell a little of her personality just sitting out here, but like, hey, we're doing an oral history, life history interview, chatting. Project.
That would be true also. Yeah, that's fair. That's so loud. Which is yeah, that's true, yeah. Like, we've had several conversations that have been, and this, but like have been, we've experimented once with like a group conversation that did not go well, because it was just too many, it didn't go very deep, actually, it went well, it just didn't go deep. But we've had at least one or two with duos. This one? I thought we had two.
No, we've had two, Maggie and Fabiano, and then Luann and Kathy.
Okay. So we've had at least two conversations that were with duo.
Luann and Terry, three.
Three, and one of which was over meal, which was really sweet. But they were, so it's, you asking that question actually raises, I hadn't considered, like, what if Maggie's like, I don't want that interview, but Sylviana's like, I really feel strongly about it. We don't have that process built into our forms, and then we really need to attend to it, or we have separate forms signed by different people, but that's it. So in theory, both are holding like intellectual rights jointly. That's an important, I don't know. It's important, yeah, thank you.
Yes, I did call it oral history when we started, and oftentimes I would have to explain what oral history, because that's not the language the community used. I could see the hesitance once I say it's an oral history, people just kind of pull back and be like, let me think about it. And then just saying as an informal conversation, telling whatever story that you wish to tell. And then at any point, I could take away any part of the story that you don't want, then people feel much more comfortable and opening up a lot more. And so taking up that first 5 minutes just to walk through what is oral history is, I think, an essential part of the project itself, allowing the community to dictate how their story is being told. And then yeah.
And again, I would defer to Treasurer to sort of add more detail. I wasn't involved in the sort of interview process other than being an interviewee. So, but there was a fairly involved invitation to a list of people via email and phone call to set up a lot of the interviews. And then there were also opportunities in space that we created where Treasurer was actually sitting in public space or space in our building at public events and just invited people to participate. So there was one very formal and one very informal kind of process. And if there were others, please share.
No, I think that's it. I mean, yeah, we had formal and informal processes, but we didn't do any group interviews.
Yeah.
Really at all. Yeah, and we've definitely called it oral histories in our process of explaining what that meant. Yeah, that was good.
Thank you.
I mean, if I could add a follow-up here, I'm wondering, oral history began as a method that involved asking people to talk about their life stories rather than sort of directed questions. And, that practice has evolved. There are different ways of sort of framing interviews. It's not always around a life story, but I'm wondering if you could talk about how much of a person's life you like to capture in your interviews, or were you really focused on the questions that were important to you in a certain project? If anyone has something to say about that.
Wait, I can just quickly say ours was fairly targeted in questions that we inquired about, but I think that they ranged pretty open as they were free flowing. So.
I came in with this loosely structured question in terms of aliveness is one of them, Minnesota is one of them, food. Now let's have fun and kind of unpack these notions. So some of the story are linear, other story are just keywords like keep popping up and people just decide what story they want to tell. But I think oral history overall is just, it's very choppy in that way. And it could be fun, but it can be very confusing at the same time, yeah.
We have a list of questions that we pre-circulate if people want them, and some people have requested to not have questions, beforehand, that they want to have the conversation flow the way that they want it to flow, and have us ask them really anything at all. And it's changed over time.
I would say that we often also start out with our list of questions and then completely forget about them. And just wander wherever the conversation takes us, which I think is a great way to do that. Wait, can and I think it's actually been really helpful to like mutually ignore the questions. Because then we can more easily move away from what we think might be a plant person miss and just see what emerges. And I think, you know, I've been really interested in the stories that people tell about childhood. And I think most of the time, if we started off the interview by saying, tell us how you were a plant person when you were a child, people would be like, I don't know what you're talking about. But actually to just sort of wandering through people's lives in this more casual way, we in the interview often will express like, oh, I didn't realize that I've been a plant person my whole life. Wow.
Sorry, I was taking myself. The piece I really wanted to add, because I think this came up for like what we learned was like, and I mean this in a very serious way, actually, is we really learned to trust our feelings in the process of conversation itself. And like, if yeah, I don't even know how to say that in a way like to articulate it well, but I would be curious to hear what y'all have to say about it too. But we have observed that when we trust the process in ourselves and our feelings, the conversations go really deep and they flow naturally, and there's a story there. And at times when we have been like, here's our, like, how did you get to Minnesota? Like, are the materials really exactly, it's been real dry, and oftentimes the feeling at the end of the conversation is not as feeling sweet or connected or whatever. That our cues that we're doing a good job.
It's an art, right?
But it actually is an art.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And then I'd love at some later date to talk about the pre-circulated questions, because that was the advice that you got not to do early on in oral history practice, but I really think it might be important to do that now. Whatever it is.
Yeah.
Khoi, do you want to add?
I guess just to respond to, where you were saying, a lot of the participants have difficulty just getting to aliveness, right? And then committing to the scheduled time. But once they know that this is a safe space for them just to go and just hang out, oftentimes, like, there are a couple participants where I just have them do whatever they want and they choose to sing. So they just like start singing for like a couple of songs, and it's one of those things where they don't want to talk about their trauma. They don't want to talk about what brought them to aliveness. They want to talk about what they inspired to do or something like that, where oftentimes most of us be like, we missed 3 meetings already. I'm done, I'm tired. But it's just sitting there creating, make sure that they have that space, and that this interview process is not about you holding space for them. This interview process is really them controlling the mic. Then I think it shifts the conversation in terms of what they want to record. If it's just singing is what they want as their part of their history, I think that is oral history itself.
Yeah.
That's great. All right, next question. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. This is really, really fascinating, and now I'm really excited to listen to the interviews that you're creating, because they sound really rich and exciting. And as I don't do interviews myself, but I listen to a lot of them, And I listened to oral interviews that have been conducted from the 50s until the, let's say, early 2000s. And that's like an older generation of people who had thought of how to do it. And I think you're presenting such a more ethical and fair and therefore also more interesting way to do it. And I really wish that these conversations existed back then, because yeah, I'm working with like troves of oral history interviews that are both like semi-ethical to my opinion, and also like lead us to a lot of dead because people, I can hear in their voices, but they're not trusting the person that they're speaking with. So this is really amazing what you're doing. And my question is actually something that Kevin raised, and I wanted to hear you reflect on this. Since this is a conversation, and you're not just there to extract, and you're there to invest and encourage people to also, you know, maybe feel like they're a part of the history. Do you see a way in which participating in this project is also making an impact on the interviewees as individuals, but also on the communal level of like how they're seeing the connection between themselves to the projects, to the organizations, to the themes and events that you're covering in your work?
Can I add on to that? I feel like that's kind of the same vein, but like something that really struck me when you were all speaking earlier is just the role that and mutuality and community care and like mutual aid play in your project. And I'm wondering like how you feel that impacts the interviews that you're doing and the like, way that you imagine that like, impacting the people that are telling their stories, and the way that that interview is going to then be used, or the way the project as a whole is then going to be used.
Can I answer both? I mean, I guess to the first question, my sense, after talking to several folks that have been interviewed by Treasure and by reading the stories and seeing certain threads pop up, people have expressed feeling part of a community that they didn't necessarily know existed, or that they were their experience and relationship to us as an organization or people, a body of work, may have felt singular, but it actually is more ensemble. And even if the relationship happened at a different age than others, or through a certain type of production or relationship of their creative practice, but to identify that also if there are threads and commonalities around calling our space a sort of creative home, that there's actually, even though there are sort of specific themes and work that's been supported and produced more than others, it's actually a multiracial sort of cohort of people that have very similar experiences, but that are also unique to their identities and the cultural production they do. So I think even for myself to have been interviewed and to be part of that, and to then identify the other people that are sort of my peers, but also family in a way, makes me feel more attached to them as people into place, community, organization. So I think that that's something that I think we pulled from it, and then I continue to learn from. And I'm not quite sure how to answer your but I will continue past it.
For me, we work a lot around identity politics, so this is like a double-edged sword for me, where it's purposely intended for a BIPOC community member who have utilized a likeness project. And I also expanded to include more minoritized groups such as women, and directly ask for more trans participants or more within different ethnic groups, particularly like Asian American. Out of the 36, we have 3. So, and looking at the larger picture of the ACT UP oral history likeness, out there 160, they have 4 Asian American. Right, so those are the representation that we want to make sure stories of different community members are represented, but at the same time, they become like a target, be like, hey, you look like you're a minority. And it becomes very tricky in terms of like, how do I make sure to honor your story and not just because you are another check for me, right? And make sure these stories are being treated in a way where it's accessible and where different community members are accessing, not just because they could see themselves in there, but there's a story that actually makes sense to them as a community itself. So talking afterward, oftentimes I mentioned to the participant that this is the first time that we only do BIPOC and women's story focusing in Minnesota. This is an impact in AIDS and HIV history that oftentimes we don't get to tell these narratives. This is one of the few times that we're actually pushing for this and making sure it's the center. And not in an extractive way, even though it is a conversation to have, what does it mean to be extractive, what does it mean to be targeted? You never want to be like, oh, I'm brown, so yay. But at the same time, it's like, yes, I'm brown, I need to take up space. Yes, this is your story, this is still your story. So it's not like me going into Minnesota and grab a random sample, right? These are targeted samples, these are targeted people because we want these stories to be highlighted. We want these stories to be actually recognized for once, and it's part of the Minnesota story that's been missing. So it's one of those double-edged swords to me where it's like, yes, identity politics is important. Potentially identity politics backfire on us because we're going into a cafeteria and pointing out brown people or women or trans people. And I don't want that icky feeling, but at the same time, we have to acknowledge what does it mean to be in that mess of both worlds.
I think in terms of impact on interviewees, it's something that after we have an interview, Macey and I always look at each other and we're like, wow, that was amazing. They thought it was amazing. Why did they think it was amazing? I don't know. I think it's something really beautiful to being heard. And I think that we try to cultivate a space where people really feel heard and feel like they can tell whatever story they want to tell. And that is nice. Right, beyond that, I think we've heard from a number of people that, you know, they know that there aren't very many resources about the history of the things that they practice. You know, people doing their own sort of ancestral research, finding that it's really hard to find resources. I remember Luann talking about it's really hard to find resources about Mennonite herbal practitioners, for example. And so feeling some appreciation that these stories can be captured in a way, especially since they aren't, like, we're not mostly interviewing like big name people, like these aren't the folks who you would go to the bookstore or Google and find as representatives of plant medicine in this region. And so it's providing an opportunity for some, I don't know, resource capturing for folks who maybe don't have that opportunity in other ways.
Interested in your word ensemble, because I think like me, like the connection, social and relational and thought and heart and spiritual connections between the people we talk to, it feels like ensemble or, and then as you're speaking, I'm thinking back to conversations where folks have said like, either I feel like I'm a piece of something larger, or I don't feel like I'm a piece of something larger. And now I'm curious to like actually go in deeper into these interviews and be like, oh, I wonder who said that and when and how.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think about that word, I think about what it means to be an individual who has gone through the process of being interviewed and then to feel a sense of being part of something larger, right? And a lot of those folks in our community, particularly the artists that we work with, are constantly hustling, right? They're part of hustle culture and they're working really hard. And a lot of them are doing social justice-based work. But not always in relationship to organizations that do social justice-based work. And so what does it mean to have a home that you can come back to that feels like it holds your work and an ensemble of people's work that want to practice in a certain way? And we often have artists that have told us, you know, I want to apply for this scholarship program over here, but the organization that hosted isn't aligned with, you know, my work or my values or my thoughts around social justice and my practice. And so I'd rather be in relationship with the organization, but we don't run that fellowship program. Right? And so I think the threads of ensemble are, even if I haven't talked to you as my artist peer about why you're here, we're here for maybe the same reasons in a way, and that's some alignment around those values, I think. I hope.
Other questions from the audience?
Everyone, it was really great to hear all of these projects. I'm in Oregon, and we've got a similar project like Minnesota Transform, and we have a lot of digital projects, some very connected via like the university's websites and the systems to set up a website, and some not. And so my question was, I'm not sure clearly how many of you actually have a website on the University of Minnesota system. No.
We will.
You will. Okay, got it. The reason why I'm asking that is we used a company called Reclaim. I don't know if that's come up for other folks, which has been really helpful for us. It's I think folks based out of Mary Washington University and used to working with these projects, because if you end up on a university website and you leave, or it's just not working out for you, they'll work with you to move it. But there are all these steps they'll also tell you about in the process of setting it up at the university, which if you have an option to not do, half of our projects are on an independent website with Reclaim, and the other half are with the university's website for the pros and cons of what that means. The second question I had was that led us to talk a lot about, I think you had mentioned things that will be more polished, that will end up more public facing, and things that will be maybe more long form, but might end up in an archive otherwise, but maybe not on the website. And I'm wondering if any of you are experiencing people wanting to talk a little bit more, fully knowing maybe the editing process is not that clear to them. So they might not realize some of the things they're talking about may not end up in the public facing site, but someone might have access to it later. And if that's sort of changed the way you do the interview. It's something we're sort of running across in some of our interviews.
Thank you for the recommendation for Reclaim. I haven't heard of that before, but I'm looking forward to checking it out. I don't think we've run into this particular issue that you're mentioning. When we interview, we say that we will have the whole thing available unless someone wants something to be rejected.
Yeah, or be private for them, like it's open for someone to also maybe want a section just to be made available to them or for whatever purposes they want. But we haven't run into that.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah.
I haven't gotten a chance to share the transcription with the participant yet, because I'm still working on it. But they would have to finally say what else they want to read back or whatnot. In terms of the raw data itself, imagining it would just sit with the consent form and whatnot. In terms of inaccessible material, but it's there if they want to make a request for it, or somehow there's an ethical access to it, and not just to go in and listen to all the raw data to make sure that they can get the redacted material. So we are working with the treasure collection in terms of like thinking through how to store these material. Right now it's just living on mostly the recorder itself, and then as I'm editing is sitting in that file, so.
I think I'm gonna have to defer to treasurer again to answer this question. The one thing that I do love about the interviews that have been posted is that when I listen to them, they're unedited, they're raw. It's like, all right, welcome, blah, blah, blah. Oh, your mic's not on. Can we like get you on here? You know, so there's a realness, and it's just an unfiltered, unedited process, but I think really beautiful, and really human. But if you have specific responses.
So the only editing that we've really done on the files that we published, have been to redact things that people didn't want in the interviews. Other than that, yeah, we kept them very raw. I think it's also really interesting because the interviews like really run a very extreme gamut in terms of length, and engagement. I mean, some of the interviews from like public event have been 5 minutes or less. And some of them have been more than 3 hours long, more than 4 hours long. And so, you know, there's, I think that the expectation has been that we're going to put everything up and that it will be public in that way. But it's also like, I haven't thought about like using it in terms of public facing, like material, like other types of materials in that sense that we've talked about, like taking inspiration from the interviews, but we haven't talked about like what we would do with the quotes from those interviews for like marketing material or something like that. I think that that brings up a lot of other questions in terms of like, in my view, that would require further consent from that interviewee. And so maybe that's something that we would really need to specifically put in policy as well.
One of the reasons I asked that question was because it comes up for us and we had to, sorry.
One of the reasons it came up as a question for me was that one of our projects, a project I'm leading, deals with a lot of oral histories. We call them testimonials, these long form migrant histories, in Spanish and other indigenous Spanish languages, indigenous languages in Latin America. And what happens is people, it's a documentary, and so some people will say, I don't want to be on it, but you can record me. And other people will say, given my citizenship status, I want this to be part of the final cut. We know you're doing this long thing, but the segments will be 15, 20 minutes. So they're clear that not everything will get included. So they'll contact us later and say, I do want that included. So there's this sense of empowerment for those who are like, make sure whatever you cut, you don't cut the part where I say I'm undocumented and unafraid. And others are like, please do cut that, but we know you'll put it in another archive. And at least if people find it, they're gonna have to work for it. And I thought it was a really interesting element to all the work that I wasn't expecting. So I've always been caught off guard by people who are like, make sure those minutes are in it. And you know, that we know, I'm like, this may get a very wide distribution. They go, we want that, and that's okay. And they're talking about their homes and their neighborhoods in small rural cities in Oregon, which are complicated.
Thanks.
I feel like we haven't run into that just because we haven't put our website online yet. And because we're planning to mostly, like the plan right now is to have the interviews online and available. And so the whole thing can just live there. But I can, as you describe it, I can imagine this happening when, if and when we come to a point of longer form writing. And people say, well, why? I told such a great story about insert thing here. When everyone tells it, when we have 70 people telling wonderful stories, we can't put them all in. That's
Say
a word.
Yeah, like, do I put this person down knowing
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't have enough space.
Yeah, so I think, I feel that
Yeah.
will be an issue. And then in terms of stories that people, you said it also goes the other way, people want to speak something but don't want it to be part of it. We invite people to have, to tell us to just turn off the recorder. And we have had folks say, I want to tell you this story, but I don't want it to be recorded. Like I want to speak it into this space, but I don't want it to be on the internet, which is great that we just push off. And there we go.
Yeah, it happens like more often. I mean, it does like not infrequent for us in this project.
If anybody online has a question, please enter it into the chat. Any other questions here? We have time, I think, for another one.
I have a question or it's mostly for graduate students, but also people who consider themselves to be academics and doing things like publishing academic work. So for people who are still in graduate school, my question is, how do you see this work like factoring into your dissertation? Is it part of your dissertation or not? Is it separate? If it's not separate, if so, how are you kind of navigating the ethics of publishing in that sense? I think that's only for Khoi, and then if Treasure wants to be the voluntary member, but also for you who, if you see yourself publishing any of this work in that academic venue, how you're navigating those things.
Well, Khoi too, right?
Yeah.
So my dissertation work with oral history interviewing Vietnamese folks in Vietnam. So it's completely disconnected from Minnesota in that sense. But what I did learn from this definitely translate over in terms of creating space for folks just building that community. And I could see the drastic change in terms of me doing the labor of going into the community where after a year, people still are very hesitant, as opposed to having Kevin work with the likeness for over many years, where this was expedited within a school year or within a semester practically, where we're able to do this and people already believe and trust in us. So that drastic change, I could see the difference between what does it mean to build community and how that impact just the connection itself. In terms of this work, I do think it needs to be part of that is part of my work, but it's also something that I also enjoy, where the dissertation drains you so much. And this drains me in a very different way, where it brings me happiness, or it brings me a different pocket of joy, where I get to think about my community. What does it mean for me to actually engage with Minnesota in a way that as a transient moving to Minnesota just for school, that is no longer just like a resting place or like a landing place. But now I am part of this community where I'm able to engage and part of that narrative and continue to build out that history. I did submit this as part of an abstract for a GLQ. It didn't work out, but it's not something that I'm very concerned about, because I think this is a project that will be heard, it will find a home. And I'm still kind of thinking through what does it mean to find a home for the community in an academic space. Because at the end of the day, I still have to write and produce this sitting by myself in an academic journal. Even though I am talking on behalf of the community that I'm still very detached from as I keep going in and out of. So how do I fairly and justly tell a story that's not quite directly mine, but yet my voice keeps surfacing up in different ways? So I think that it's a fun project in that sense to think through what is my responsibility to the community that way. How is it that the community can tell their own story, even in an academic journal that most of the community are not interested in reading a scholarly article published in like the history or American study journal that only 500 people might be reading. So what does it mean then to make this a public access work even? So, yeah.
I have a related response. I mean, maybe this relates or it doesn't, but as part of a separate relationship with funders, we have embedded in our organization a research ethnographer that spent the last year with us, and a cohort of 18 organizations across the country, each have a research ethnographer doing a project based on the work. And so one of the challenges that he is bumping up against is what is his accountability to the organization versus what is accountability to the research and publishing it, and like some of his peers solidifying his tenure track position, right? So sort of the ethical dilemma of being embedded in the community institution and doing that work, but also the pressure of wanting to present good work so that his job security is sort of held intact as well.
Thank you. Treasurer, did you want to add something? No. Quasi panelists. I think you can put us on your CV. All right, I think we're done now. Thank you so much. This was a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate everybody. And